This lecture, as you can already tell, is challenging in that there is so much going on in Mesopotamia that it is a real challenge to get down to the bare bones and leave enough space for these other three sites that we're back in a way to the let's check in four very different locations on the planet. And I'm still torn between which approach works better. I'd love to hear from you which you think is better. If I were you, I'd want a more condensed, thematic, where four sites are very much related. But that kind of works against the larger goal of the course, which is to get a sense of the world and get a sense of how similar things, and this lecture is really good at this, similar things are happening in different parts of the world, and some aspects of that development are similar, and some aspects are very different. And so, in a way, that's our challenge, is to look at the evidence, as much as we would like to make generalizations about the whole world, is to actually pay attention to the evidence and say things that the evidence supports, and not indulge in grand generalizations. For example, when I took this course and when I TA'd this course, this is like my sixth pass through the material, and even the way I've taught it in the past, I do what my teachers did, and we say, well, where do cities come from? What is this thing called civilization? This word you may have noticed I've been avoiding. This word civilization is tricky. If you try to define it, it basically means everyone who's not me is a barbarian, and the savage. So there's the civilized and savage dichotomy. It's a very dangerous territory. As we saw with the Mongols, are the Mongols civilized? Are they savage? Well, they kind of are the exception that proves the rule, that we tend to be drawn towards boundary lines. And again, this course has been trying to problematize the use of boundary lines. And this is one of the most problematic boundary lines available to us, which is us and them. We are civilized, they are savages. The word barbarian comes from the Greek, where anyone who doesn't speak Greek is labeled a barbarian because when they speak, it sounds like bar, 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 bar. So that's where the word barbarian comes from, which is interesting that now we say it's Greek to me is to say we don't understand what you're talking about. So that's an ironic twist. But when I was taught this stuff, and when I have taught this in the past in a less historically grounded way, I would say things like agriculture emerged, and I'd give it a date, and the date would be 10,000 BCE, or 8,000 BC, or 6,000 BC, or somewhere in there. And I would tell the story that as soon as hunters and gatherers learned agriculture and settled down, they specialized, and that specialization was supported by the growth of cities. And that's it. That's the story. Well, it turns out that that story comes from a very specific body of historical evidence, which is another way of saying we have dug a few holes and we have discovered a few cities in Mesopotamia. And the evidence seems to suggest, both the physical evidence in the ground and the written documents that we've been able to get a hold of and translate, supports that story. That is the story of how it went in Mesopotamia. So let's tell that story very specifically in Mesopotamia and not generalize it to the whole world. Let's tell it as the story of agricultural and urban development in Mesopotamia, specifically in the city of Uruk, and then compare that with how things have happened elsewhere, like in China. And we'll look at all this. So let's, starting at MIT, moving across, we're going to Mesopotamia. We're crossing the Mediterranean. We're looking at the Middle East, and this is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Meso means between, Potamia refers to the two rivers. And what do we find there now? Not even a dig site. There are so many different places labeled Uruk on the globe. There seems to be some confusion. The thing is that the river Euphrates has moved so many times, and the Persian Gulf itself has receded something like 250 kilometers. And so there's this vast geography. So much time has gone by since the time of Uruk, 5,000 years, that there's not much left to look at, and it's not even the same place as it was before. So we're going to start with very recent evidence that finally allows us to say what used to be speculative generalization, and now we have very specific evidence. We have the ruin of a boat. Increasingly, we use radar and sonar and satellite imaging, and we are finding stuff all over the place right now. Every week, another satellite goes over and they say, dig here, dig here. The banners, the pins in the map where we need to dig have multiplied exponentially in the last few decades because of these remote sensing technologies. One of the places indicated, or many of the places are underwater, as we've talked about in Alexandria. Here's a place off the coast of Turkey where they said, there's something going on here. We found the oldest boat ever found. We had to reconstruct our sense of when boat technology developed. This boat is much more sophisticated at a much earlier moment than we ever suspected. We very carefully looked at where the cargo distributed itself, and scientists have attempted very carefully to reconstruct where these things were in the boat. But more importantly than where they were in the boat is what they are. But just to say, the technologies just to find these things and then to analyze them is taking leaps and bounds, and as we've said the whole semester, the information is exploding. And so we are increasingly able to speak intelligently now with evidence, following Missouri rules, which is, of course, don't say anything that you can't show. This boat is filled with ingots of of copper, and of tin, and of glass, and small, very precious things. And checking out where these things have come from, we are now able to say with some scientific certainty that the boat starting in the Aegean Sea, Greece, basically what we call Greece now, but at that point it was Mycenae, which you know of from the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Trojan Wars, which is another theme of the course, is that we have these stories and this literature for the first time. And these stories and this literature straddle myth and history and tell us a great deal, not just technically, but of what people were thinking and doing. But this boat came across and went up the coast of what we call Israel now, but used to call Canaan. And I should be pointing with a laser, not a cursor. Up Canaan and through this area. Here's Mesopotamia through here. And so we have tin and ivory coming to this coastline. We have other things coming up from below. Ebony, which is a very precious wood. We have tin coming from the mountains up here. The Zagros Mountains over here play a very important role. And so we have all these materials coming to the town of Ugarit, copper, all these things, and going back by boat back to Mycenae. And so what is going on here, this trade? This is the bronze that gives us the term the Bronze Age. what is bronze? 10 parts copper, 1 part tin. You mix it together, you get bronze. You could also use arsenic instead of tin, but that's more dangerous and not as high quality. And so all of a sudden you have these bronze objects appearing where there had been none. And here we can actually recreate from the mines and the sources of these materials a sense of where these goods are flowing from and to in order to make it possible to have bronze and also gold. Now, why Mesopotamia? Is Mesopotamia a resource-rich place? No. They have almost nothing. They have ducks, fish, grass, and that's it. So why Mesopotamia? And this is something that Mark Jarzenbeck has developed quite wonderfully, and we're going to be using his slides, that there was a discovery because of the fresh water. And this is something that has been neglected somewhat over the course so far, is the importance of fresh water, the importance of an abundant, ready, local supply of fresh water. It is a game changer. And we can be forgiven for not realizing that so much because we take it for granted. Well, in the next 100 years, that will change. And this history will become more and more relevant because of the fundamental role played by water in terms of all of these things. Here you can see the ancient coastline compared with where it is today. So this entire area was under the sea, all salt water. The fresh water of the Tigris and Euphrates coming in, creating in this basically what is a wasteland of desert, a fertile zone, which we call the Fertile Crescent. But is it the fertility that makes it all possible? Not so much. What's really going on here is that because they can take advantage of the local fertility at this area, the local fertility of the gold and brown soils here allows them to produce a surplus, but only through very aggressive measures. And we'll be talking about this more in the last lectures of how there are 56 edible grains in the world, and many of them can be found here. 32 of those 56 edible grains can be found here. And this sudden sharp transition from hunting, gathering to agriculture is not so sharp. If you're gathering edible grains, you tend to eat 9 and then take the fattest one of those 10 grains that you've collected and you put it back. So that next season, those fat grains are favored. And by making these tiny little choices, making it part of the cultural expectation of the society, and socially transmitting that cultural expectation, it's not so much a revolution, it's only revolutionary in retrospect. It's a very slow evolution. And so it's selected, it's not natural selection, it is unnatural, it's artificial selection, it is intentional selection. And that's how we very gradually get agriculture. But there is something very sudden that happens. Now the other thing to look at in this map is the Zagros and Taurus mountains are rich in other things that are useful. Forests with cedar and cypress trees, which we've mentioned in the architecture of other sites. And the metals that make tool making possible, and the precious metals that make it that support the worship of the gods. So something very revolutionary happens. It's when a decision is made to irrigate. Now, irrigation is not a piecemeal, lonely choice. In order to irrigate, you have to get your act together, and you have to help your neighbors get their act together. And you have to collectively coordinate everything. And you have to make sure that nobody drops the ball. You have to dig a ditch and then maintain that ditch through a series of levees. And if one person blows it, the whole place floods. And so the Tigris and Euphrates are not the nice, gentle rivers that we will see in the Indus River Valley and the Nile. It is a ferociously capricious river, and it takes extreme measures to control the flooding. It takes extreme measures to organize the society, not just to maintain the engineered landscape, but also to organize the worship of the gods and maintain the balance of heaven and earth so that things work. And so you can imagine if this is what it looks like, and the extremity of the rising and falling of these rivers, what it takes. And out of this comes a very dramatic, very rapid development of specialization. So it's not exactly the story that my teachers told us. It's more specific than that. It's the waterworks, the demand for the engineering, and the demands for the appeasement of the gods. And at this time, in the city of Uruk, we have the story of Gilgamesh. One of the first, some would say the first, written story that we have received through a series of clay tablets that were preserved in libraries, first in Sumerian Mesopotamia, then in Babylonian, the library of Ashurbanipal, where that collection, unlike the Library of Alexandria, was left intact and is in the British Museum. And so these elaborate engineering fortifications and the worship complexes are what we're going to look at very quickly in what's left. And what helps us is that we have seen this before. Remember Cartagena? Remember Batavia? It's the same thing. We could almost be looking, it has all the same elements. We have the harbor, we have the fortress, multiple layers of the fortress. We have the canal network. We have the protected harbor here where the boats can dock. And we have shop houses, warehouses mixed into the residential district. And it's what we've been calling the Harbor Fortress Canal Factory Town. And we saw it in the colonial period. We see it today. And we see it all the way back here. So it's nice when we have these things to recognize. We have found the remains of worship centers, and this one we've rebuilt, Ziggurat of Ur. Every Sumerian city would have had that type of worship complex. We also see housing districts, which we can imagine from the ruins what it's like, and it's very familiar. There are bedrooms, there are living rooms, there are places of worship. People are less familiar, are burial of family members in the house itself. But there are even bathrooms with flushing things. Here we get to the main event here, which are these stone cone mosaic temple complexes. And here we are sacrificing lambs, offering music to the delight of the gods, all for the sustenance of fertility. And to keep it going. And so you have this explosion of population based on this system because it works so well. And the story of Gilgamesh is the story of the birth of the city. Do you guys know, have you studied Gilgamesh? So Gilgamesh is a king who is full of himself and he's abusing his power. And so the gods send Enkidu from the forest, and Enkidu is captured, and he is tamed. He is taught how to wear clothes. He is taught how to eat food that is cooked. He is taught how to grow grains. He is taught how to speak beyond bar, 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 bar. So Enkidu is the story of that transition from unagricultural hunter-gatherer barbarians into urban-dwelling civilized people. And it's a brilliant story in its own way, because Enkidu regrets the whole thing. Because eventually the gods say he must be punished for his killing of these other gods. Gilgamesh and Enkidu become best friends, and they go off and they chop down a gigantic tree to build a wonderful temple door. So the architecture comes into the story. But more importantly, it's the gates of the city where Enkidu enters, becomes civilized, and then regrets it. So we have this elaborate complex that grows and is ritually demolished and rebuilt every few hundred years. And we see this sequence. We have two types of construction. One is the use of limestone for these constructions. And then we have these amazing shaped cones of stone and colored, deeply embedded into the walls. And it's a remarkable technique that really we don't see much after that. It's fairly unique. And then we see the ziggurat constructions, and here's a very interesting one. This is the white temple at the top of the ziggurat in Uruk. And Uruk is really the first primate city. What is a primate city? Bangkok is the primate city of Thailand. The next largest city is less than half the size of Bangkok. We don't have a primate city in the United States, but Paris is the primate city of France. The next largest city is less than half as big. It dominates. It is a game changer. You could destroy the nation state of France simply by attacking Paris. Uruk was the first, not just the first city, but really the first primate city. It was so much larger than anything else around it. It had no walls for a long time. It had no weapons. It was at peace. And at the top of this is this white gypsum temple that would be polished white so it would shine in the sun across the landscape. And I couldn't find any visualizations of that. But around 2900 BCE, they build a wall. And it's this massive, incredible wall because they start to be attacked by nomadic peoples. And one of the challenges of teaching this topic is you have the Sumerians, then you have the Elamites, you have the Akkadians, you have the Babylonians, you have all of these different, the Neo-Assyrians. They are conquering peoples that come through. They occupy these cities. They destroy some and they vanish into the dust. They remake these cities, complicating the story tremendously. And then we get to Persian Persepolis, which we know very well from last night. But so it's a very difficult history to sort out unless you're willing to get into all the wars and conflicts. So we're going to focus on this one, because of the way this course is focused, we love the evidence of Mari. Mari is a town on the Euphrates River, and it becomes the point of exchange from the overland routes from as far away as Pakistan and modern-day India, across, and the sea routes also coming up the Euphrates River, and this is the point of interchange. And from here, it goes by horse or donkey-drawn carts, and then later, this incredible invention, the camel. Camels are tough because they don't reproduce very well, but they develop artificial insemination. Suddenly, you can have growing populations of camels, and you can cross the desert to Jericho or Ugarit, as we saw at the first one. And now you have trade with Egypt. So the connection between Sumerian Mesopotamian cities, and Egypt is one of those big game changers of this ancient historical story. More on that in the future. But again, what do we see? We see the harbor, fortress, canal, factory town again. A very clear example of that. And we have a pretty clear idea of how the palace at the center of Mari operated. I want you to notice how labyrinthine this whole thing is. It turns out that labyrinthine is a defensive strategy that we're going to be looking at a couple of these different sites. The palm court, represented with more than one palm, that's hard to find. Clay tablets are the medium of writing. Clay tablets allow you to write something, and then when you're done, you erase it by putting water on it and scrubbing it clean. If you want to make a permanent record, you bake it, and it becomes indelible. It's like pencil that turns into ink. And so this is the creation of writing. How did writing start? Possession. I'm now growing grain. I'm growing a surplus. I'm giving at least half of what I grow to the government. They are distributing it in clay bowls. And around the rim of the clay bowls, and I'm sorry I don't have that picture, are markings that reinforce this social institution of social welfare. Part of what is amazing about these early Mesopotamian cities is they're not so socially stratified as the grand generalization of the history I was taught would lead us to believe. For hundreds and hundreds of years, there is a very low degree of stratification and a lot of peace. And that changes as we see. But these are the clay tablets. The pictograms become ideograms. So on the top you see the pictogram of star. It's not so clear at this one because it's biaxially symmetrical, but by turning these pictograms on their side, you turn them from pictograms into ideograms. It's no longer a thing, it's now an idea. You can also add a mark and say, I'm not talking about the thing star, I'm talking about the idea of heaven or God. And so here's Gilgamesh. With writing comes the story of Gilgamesh battling the lion, and we have king lists. The first writing is there's a lot of grain coming from this field owned by this guy, and there's lots and lots of listing and accounting that makes this complex social arrangement viable. There's also lists of kings, so we start to have the beginning of documents that allow us to construct histories. And here, this is just a quick view of the complexity of the kingdoms and civilizations that take over. Here we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have it in more than one language, allowing us to decode it, the Rosetta Stone. And these tablets are first stored in the very large library in Ur, and then with the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, they are transferred to the library of Ashurbanipal, who is the emperor who takes great pride in his ability to speak multiple languages and to preserve knowledge. And it's when Alexander the Great, who we saw sweeping through this region shortly after the Persians have conquered the Babylonians, Alexander the Great comes through a few hundred years later, conquers the Persians, but he gets wind of this library of Ashurbanipal and the grandness of Babylon. These are just speculative renditions of the Tower of Babel and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But we have the actual Ishtar Gate from the later kingdom in Babylon, of course, in the Berlin Museum. And it's the library of Ashurbanipal in Babylon that inspires Alexander the Great to build the Library of Alexandria, which we looked at before. We also get the British discovering the Library of Ashurbanipal and bringing it in its entirety to the British Museum, with a stop-off first at the Crystal Palace. So I couldn't resist. And then it ends up in the British collection. At the present moment, one of the things that ISIS is doing to terrorize the world is to find these sites and destroy them utterly and irretrievably. And so historic heritage is one of the first casualties of war. It's not the most horrible thing that we lose, because humanity, genocide trumps patricide of heritage aside and herbicide, but it is very quickly becoming a very effective tool of warfare, and it's a very disturbing development. Questions? By asking a question, you allow me to fill in the holes that I forgot. Thank you.
Just kind of not really, but
I'll find a way.
if people started writing on clay tablets, they obviously had paint before that, right? They were painting.
Yeah. But it's crazy. But future archaeologists may or may not notice that there's a slightly higher level of silicon in the soils around MIT, saying, there's a silicon-based form of worship here. They probably won't notice. Silicon is a very common thing. So, and there certainly won't be any digital records. So they will find this lecture hall. They won't find our computers. They'll misinterpret these computers as amulets to some god. Similarly, the evidence of paint is preserved in caves. We see cave painting as some of the earliest evidence. The painting here is more difficult because it is more fragile than the clay tablets. Clay tablets are remarkably long-lived. And what's better than clay? Bronze. That's why we call it the Bronze Age, is because we find bronze. So we're not going to be called the computer age or the information age. They're not going to find our computers. They're not going to find our information. What are they going to find? They're going to call it the car age. They're going to call it the petroleum age, because how else can you explain all these glass buildings? How cavalier were they with energy? It's the free energy age. They will speculate that energy was free, and that's the only way to explain what we see here, buried off the coast of what used to be the United States here at MIT. Other questions? Okay. Zooming out, we're going not that far away, back to the Mediterranean Sea, familiar territory to us, very close to Athens, Greece. For a long time, part of Greece, including currently, the island of Crete, where the palace of Knossos, the palace at Knossos, was there a king Minos or not? Historians are mixed. So should we call it a palace? Some people are proposing that we no longer call it the palace of Knossos. We should call it the labyrinth of Knossos, because it's this very interesting architecture. Another thing that has happened in the thousands of years since this was built is people who aspire to a more pleasant, positive human society in the future look at the evidence from the island of Crete, from this moment in history of the labyrinth of Knossos, and they say, look how peace-loving, look how artistically oriented, look how delightful, look how open, look how wonderful the world was at one point. And some people believe this is the point of inspiration for the stories about Atlantis, because it is in the middle of the sea, isolated away from all the brutality and warfare and destruction of the mainland areas, but not for long. Okay, so one of the things to look at here directly in the architecture, based on that, is this transition from landscape to porch to interior spaces to corridor, back to interior space to porch to courtyard. And so if you cut a section through this building, you get this delightfully humanistic embrace of openness. It's not an architecture of fear, it's an architecture of hope. So just saying those words. Oh, where have I heard those words before? Medellin, Colombia, the first lecture. So it's a very hopeful architecture. It's a big armature for artwork. The frescoes and the plasters that have been found, the sculpture, the columns themselves are so delightful. But starting with the landscape, there's this mountain Juktos, which is associated with King Zeus, and the palace was oriented towards Mount Juktos, where there's a cave, which is supposedly the site where Zeus gave birth, not Zeus, but Zeus and his goddess gave birth to several of the deities that are very important to the palace at Knossos. And so we have that orientation. We have the palace being constructed not on the easiest site, in a way, in the most difficult site, being constructed out of the raw rock, the stone that is embedded in the planet itself. And so it has this relationship to the earth that recalls the caves in the mountains and gives this interesting complexity. It's not symmetric because the rock outcroppings do not allow that. And they don't choose the flatland sites. There's not much left, but what is left gives us the ability to reconstruct things in this way. So one of the things we can say about this is the entrance in the west gives us a very gives us a very labyrinthine path into the whole complex, which would have taken us up through this audience hall, up these grand stairways, and this is where the audience with the king would have been, and it overlooks the bull court. Now the bull is a key feature of Knossos, and the bull is connected with Zeus and there's evidence of human sacrifice towards the bull, and here's the throne room, which was a low-ceiling space where is it a throne room for the king, or is it a place where the tributes, who were about to enter the bull court and encounter the bull, prepare for death? We're still trying to figure that out. And you see the bull horns architecturalized here. The court of the bull is there. Too many. So here's some of the great artwork. And you can see there in the doorway, this Prince of Lilies in the doorway, leading down into the labyrinth of the palace. Here's the most famous piece of artwork from this complex. It's titled The Bull Jumper, or the Toreador, where we now believe them to be human sacrifice, but they would play with the bull. They would attempt to leap over the horns of the bull, vaulting off the back of the bull and to be caught by the waiting tribute. But eventually they would die and be part of the sacrifice. The griffins and the dolphins, just this very wonderful art, the goddesses, the priestesses who portray themselves as goddesses. These wonderfully open staircases to bring the light down into the labyrinthine complex of rooms below. And these beautiful columns, these inverted tapered wood columns on these cushion capitals, brightly colored, wonderfully still there for us to see and reconstructed. And so we envision this remarkable existence where it seems like even those who are about to perish at the horns of the bull seem to take delight in doing so. And so we have all these misty-eyed, romantic visions. This, of course, is the location of the Greek myth of the Minotaur in the labyrinth, the hybrid human bull hidden down in the labyrinth to be fed the human sacrifice that is 12 per year in the mythology. The storage vaults. So there would be a factory operation inside this complex. There was a bronze forgery, true to the Bronze Age theme, and there were drains. The whole place had plumbing and drainage, which is lost like concrete for several centuries. Here we go down into the labyrinth, and it's this type of experience down below it. Bronze, gold. A volcanic eruption occurs around 1600, a huge tsunami. The whole place is buried in ash and silt. Some believe it was abandoned altogether, but it was re-established by the Mycenaean Empire, formerly of the Greek peninsula and those islands. And so we see new palace complexes very much building on the cultural precedents of what we see in Knossos. Any questions about the labyrinth of Knossos, which I'm going to call it? We'll redo this. Yes?
Without the wood pillars still like those in the samples and stuff like all rotted away.
How is it still standing?
Like I guess like how it was wood stuff, like wooden structures still.
Oh, how's the wood still there?
Yeah.
It's partially reconstructed. You saw the scaffolding, but we still had enough evidence of a few columns that allowed us to reconstruct more and more. The staircase is the place that is so clearly rebuilt. In that slide, you can see that they're still working on it. Was that your question, Susie? Okay. Other questions? Okay. Even the digital model does not match that.
How do they decide when to just leave it alone and when to rebuild it? There must be a lot of people who argue both ways.
That's such a great question. When do you leave it alone? When do you rebuild it? The best answer, and I'm a little frightened of the prospect of making it a short answer, comes from Alois Riegel in Vienna about 120 years ago, was asked by the Viennese government, hey, when should we leave it alone and when should we rebuild it? He gave a great answer. He said, look at it, determine what is valuable, and the implication is, determine what is valuable to you right now, which is controversial, because we are the stewards of human history. Shouldn't we have a larger perspective? But basically it boils down to, what's important to you right now? If it's important that it's old, then don't touch it. If it's important that it represents the triumph of Emperor Trajan at the moment where he returns victoriously to Rome, then keep it intact, maintain it. So it depends. The answer is, it depends on what is valuable to human society at any given moment. And so one of the reasons we do history backwards is because what we're looking at and the stories that are told about it, in some cases, as we saw with the Parthenon last week, say more about us than it says about the original society. So that's why I'm emphasizing the romantic, misty-eyed vision of these sites, because the only reason they're being taught is because South America, is because the Andes Mountains, is because they were important to someone at some point. This site from around 800 BCE doesn't have much to show for itself. There is no written record. So in a way, it's an exception to the pattern of the other three sites of this lecture. It's Chavín de Huántar here in the Andes Mountains. Again, we're faced with this question, why? Why would anyone live here? Why would anyone invest? It's such an impossible landscape. It's practically on the equator, but it's so mountainous, there's snow. Crazy. But recall, And here we are at this sacred convergence of rivers. We see that in cultures throughout time, that where rivers come together is a sacred place. So we're back to this field where this archaeological dig is, next to the present-day town. So here's the site of Chavan de Huantar, next to this town. Why? Because of the rockiness, yes.
Sorry, what's the town called?
I don't know.
Also,
Ancash? Ancash.
but it's not Ollantaytambo.
It's not which town?
Ollantaytambo.
No, it's not near Cusco. Several hundred kilometers from Cusco, much farther north. So here we have, I never noticed this before, but it says Asia. What's that doing there? It is Peru. Okay. Asia. Interesting. So we have, maybe this is during Gondwanaland times, but we have this geological, dramatic geological formation that is the Andes Mountains. What it means is Chavan de Huantar is a 6-day walk from the coast. And the coast is a 6-day walk from Chavan de Huantar. And on the other side is the tropical rainforest. So we have what we've seen before, and we've shown this slide before. Remember this slide? This is the vertical archipelago. And it's a lot like Mesopotamia. It's a lot like the city of Uruk. It's a lot like the Euphrates Valley, where by irrigating, you create this remarkable landscape for producing one thing. As long as you have connection to places that are capable of producing large cypress trees, copper and tin, other goods, tools, iron becomes an important thing. As long as you have access to these other resources, it's not just okay to specialize and become the go-to civilization for wheat. It becomes a huge advantage. Because once you are the champs at wheat and other people need that wheat, you can set whatever price you want. And that gives you an advantage, and that's worth going to war for. So that's what we see here in the vertical archipelago. We saw it the last time we were in the Andes, and we see it still, because Chavan de Huantar is nearby the slopes above it, at even higher elevation, where they herd animals, including llamas, that they can eat, a great source of protein from the highlands. They are at the same elevation of these high elevation loving plants like potatoes, extremely powerful source of calories. They are very nearby the river valleys where maize grows, and every 100 years the corn gets plumper and plumper, and until today it is the superpower of caloric intake. Corn is king, not just because of US government subsidies, but because biologically it packs so much fuel into such a small package. Corn is amazing. And one of the lectures that got lost in the snow day was the Follow the Corn lecture, where we go from one corn-based society, we follow the path of corn moving through the Americas. This is one of those sites. And then a mere 6 days walk away, the other source of animal-based protein, fish on the coast. And so the exchange in this very close proximity in this vertical archipelago is the basis of high degrees of specialization and the sophistication that is required to achieve what doesn't look so impressive here, but wait till we get inside. Moving quickly, we see the circular courtyard that is the center of worship. And this is where the collective ceremonies occur. But what's more interesting this is the clearest portrayal of it because there is so little evidence remaining on the surface of the ground. Is this sunken plaza. here where the main events are. And then you see this, there was been labeled the Plaza Mayor after the Spanish colonial tradition. Is it really a Spanish Plaza Mayor? Well, not so much. We're not sure what happened here. But you have these temples that flank the sunken circular plaza in a U shape facing south. And this is the appropriate focus. And this model doesn't quite show it, but right on axis of this stairway and this portal going into the temple, it's a building. It looks like a landscape, but it's actually a building. It especially looks like a landscape now that it's been buried. But what we see is this, again, a labyrinth. So up the stairs, we see a building. Here's the U-shaped building. And in this, these three buildings, actually, interconnected buildings, is basically a labyrinth. And we go into the labyrinth remarkably similar to what we see it in Crete, in Knossos. And this is the main event. And this is my favorite part of this site. It's this thing called a lanzon. We also call it a stele, which is a large stone that has been carved. So this is a lanzon stele, which has these carvings. And it was the embodiment of a god. And the carvings on it indicate a smiling beast with fangs and hair and eyebrows that are really made out of snakes. And many feel that there was probably an opiate involved in the ceremony, but one would go into the labyrinth alone. The priest would enter and commune with the god of this stone. And there's a lower chamber and an upper chamber, and I couldn't find a good section drawing. I don't think the one in Mark's book, I don't trust it myself. Because there's an upper chamber. And in the upper chamber, someone could hide and speak in a trance state through the god speaking through the hidden priest as if the stone itself was speaking. So you can see this kind of upper chamber shelf up there where the light is. And here's this stone, this lanzon stele. And the lanzon god is holding a conch shell that is a trumpet to signal whatever comes out from this communal connection with the gods inside the temple. And this site is filled with these precious metals that is part of this complex exchange, the gold that the Spaniards and the Portuguese were after when they came to the New World. These are also one of the most fascinating aspects of what we find here are these sculpted figures that are sculpted in the round, three-dimensional, as three-dimensional things, and then embedded in the wall. And so these things were like gargoyles stuck into the walls throughout the complex. And you have the angry head, you have the cat head. The lanzon stele is a hybrid being between a cat and a human, like we see the bull and the human hybrid at Knossos. So this very elaborate pantheon of animal deities that are worshipped at this site and are the object of all kinds of object production that are throughout the site. Many of these are embedded in the platform itself, something you can't see from those other photos when you arrive on the site. But this is really what signals archaeologists to what is happening below ground. There's a lot going on here in terms of deity worship. And the material production of the gold indicates to us, allows us to say things about these trade networks, like we did like we saw in Mesopotamia, the long-distance trade networks that allow specialization, along with this rich material culture, is something that would not otherwise be possible. So questions about this? Allowing me to fill in the blanks.
I wanted to know about the maze architecture. Is it possible that maze architecture kind of comes from like extractive architecture, like when you pull up against rocks or like excavate? Like where does it come from?
Great question. Is this one of those rock cut architectures like we saw at Lalibela? Is it the kind of thing that Mark Jarzenbeck would be thrilled over because it's dug in, it's the opposite of building? Is it the result of mining some of these things? In this case, no. These are buildings, they are built, and later landslides bury them. But they are constructed. The corridors are narrow so that they can be spanned with large stones. The slide that were in it, it's like Knossos in that it is being spanned by a very large cut stone. So these are buildings.
So it's like structural in the sense that they can't support large open spaces yet. So they
Yeah. Some believe that large open spaces were covered over, but they would have been very temporary, ephemeral, wood, perishable structures. The stonework here was never the intention to be Roman about it and span large spaces with stone. It was very labyrinthine. It's part of the mystical experience of entering to confer with the lance and stele gods. Other questions? Good questions. Okay. So zooming out from South America, we are heading back to China. And it's not the last time we're going to China, I'm happy to say. We just have to pick up some business because there's so much going on in China. So here we are back at Chang'an, the modern city of Xi'an. And very close to it is this burial mound of the first emperor of China. Now there's lots of kings of China before this. There's even dynasties. There might have been a Xia dynasty. We don't know. It's semi-mythical. There was definitely a Zhao dynasty. That's when Confucius lived. And before that, a Shang dynasty. But after the Zhao, am I pronouncing that right? Zhou? Zhou, thank you. So the Zhou dynasty, where there's a recognizable succession of kings, and I'm not going to say emperor because we haven't had an empire yet, it falls apart, understandably, given how large an area this is, how vast the different peoples are, how different, when you have this large of a territory, you get distinct ethnic groups. And during the Zhou dynasty, you see this ethnic cleansing effort. So we banished the Viet, the non-Viet people to the south, the Di, the Tian, the Nom, the peoples who we now call Burmese, the people we now call Laos and Khmer. All of these distinct ethnic groups are encouraged, not to get into the specific history of that, they're encouraged to leave and go south, purifying the races in the attempt, and this is one of the first examples of this, to construct what one could possibly refer to as a nation. And what are the characteristics of a nation? A common ethnicity, a common language, which quickly brings us to some of those efforts. We have the Warring States period of several centuries of 7 warring states that are finally vanquished by the most powerful. And it becomes, he establishes so the cities during the Warring State period start out as cult centers. And it's just, where do you go to worship? I'm going into the city. I'm going into town for the cult worship. And they quickly become, during the Warring States period, places of military refuge. So I'm going into town, and you're coming with me because we have to escape the war. And so the towns go from cult centers to fortified enclaves to protect from the violence. We have the king Ying Zheng, who one by one conquers each of the other 6 warring states. And as he conquers them, he builds a replica of their palace. And we don't have evidence of this, and I'm breaking the rules by talking about it without showing it to you. Haven't found the visual evidence, but it's just too cool. I apologize. Is it okay if I tell you about this? Okay. He captures the young women and the most dangerous warriors, and he takes them back to his city of Xi'an, Xi'an actually, near Xi'an, and he builds a replica of the palace. He puts this population in it. He's entertained by the young women as they sing, and he keeps an eye on the warriors and feels good about himself keeping them captive. And so he collects 6 of these as he conquers one warring state after another. I wish I had a picture of that. And then he goes about the business of establishing an empire. He says, here's the language, you've got to use it. If you don't use it, I will kill you. Here's the written language, use that. Here's the currency, it's a coin, copper coin on a string, use that. That's the currency of the land. He says these stories are okay, and these stories are not. He burns everything that's not okay. Let's get to see what we're looking at. He builds canals. Canals, we always talk about the Great Wall. He was one of the first people to take these stretches of rammed earth walls and connect them. So they become interconnected. And I'm not going to say the Great Wall of China because it's in a different place than the one we know, the one we studied when we were looking at Ming Dynasty China, when we were looking at the Forbidden City. I've never heard anyone say this, so I'm going to assert that I'm the first one to do this. I'm going to call it a Great Wall of China. The idea of a Great Wall starts thousands of years earlier than the Ming Dynasty's stone Great Wall, the Great Wall that we know now. So one of the several Great Walls is his doing. Canals, as much attention as the Great Wall gets, and the Great Walls get, the canals are so much more important to China, and that's going to be the main idea of the next time we visit China. But I have to give this emperor some credit for connecting these 2 great river valleys. There's the Yellow River connected with the Wei River. There's the Yangtze River, and then there's what is it? Oh, it says right there, Pearl River. And so he connects the 2 river valleys by building a pretty short canal. He's able to connect the Yangtze River system, navigable system, to the Pearl River. And we know, I've actually finally found someone to quantify it. Moving something by water like this is 170 times more efficient than moving it by wheels, by wheeled transportation. In terms of just, you guys like physics, right? In terms of energy consumption, 170 times. So when the future archaeologists look back at our period, they are digging a hole and they find MIT, that's one of the things they're going to note. Oh, look, it wasn't just that there's 170, it wasn't just that energy is free back in the 21st century. They also used water transportation. They would bring their drinking water from Fiji. I hope they don't name our civilization after that. So he builds Xi'an, establishes his kingdom, the clan house, and I'm going to call it a clan house because that's what we recognize now. The center, the physical, formal, spatial, institutional arrangement that dominates our evidence of Chinese social operation is the clan house. So I'm going to call it the clan house. It rises at this point to become the center of things, and he builds this glorious palace, which looks to be remarkable in and of itself. And in order to not be assassinated, because this guy is famous in Chinese history for being the most delusional tyrant of all Chinese history. As a matter of fact, the Han Dynasty that follows very shortly after is so successful for 400 years because they contrast themselves to the wackadoodle tyranny of this first emperor. He is obsessed with the plots to assassinate him. Why? Because everyone around him is trying to kill him. It's true. It's not just paranoid delusion. He thwarts several assassination attempts, and he becomes obsessed with secrecy, and the palace architecture is a reflection of that. At this point, the palace halls, already for several centuries, when you build a house and you're a powerful clan leader, you build it up high, because when someone else comes for a negotiation, you want to intimidate them. So I don't have to explain that. We've been looking at that throughout human history. Intimidation is one of the great things that architecture does really well. But this guy, Shi Huangdi, Huangdi means emperor, Shi means the first. So Shi Huangdi uses the strategy of elevating his palace up, and then he makes this very complicated structure. Why is he doing this? So no one knows where he is. And this is part of his power, this secrecy of where he is. And this is to thwart assassination attempts, in part. He doesn't want to die so badly, he sends an expedition to look for the elixir of immortality. We see that in other sites throughout time, this obsession with the fountain of youth. He standardizes the currency. That slide should have been earlier. And so he's doing this stuff. So we get a glimpse here of not just his tomb, but of his palace. And we get a glimpse of, I think they're making too much out of this wall. It was really, maybe that's right. Very quickly we get a glimpse of the wall. But this is supposed to be the tomb that he builds for himself, this bronze replica of the palace, a map, a gigantic architectural map of the entire realm. He gets sealed inside. Some say they kill all the workmen so no one knows where it is. They use oil lamps to keep them burning for the longest possible time. But here's the weird thing. It's a replica of China where the rivers are flowing with mercury. And they pump the mercury, supposedly. The account says that the mercury is in constant circulation to recreate the earth in his tomb. This tomb, and because we're going backwards, this might not sound like a big deal, but you know about those pyramid things in Egypt, right? You've heard of those. This supposedly was much larger, much more expensive, a much bigger deal than any of those pyramids. So here we see the tomb was found under this giant mound. He dies in the year 210 BCE. He needs to be protected in life, so he surrounds himself with an army, and yes, in death. So he builds this terracotta soldier to protect him, and then he builds his horse, and then he builds some more, and then he builds some more. He builds some more. He's got 7,000 of these terracotta warriors, and one of the things that people are struggling with is, did each one get crafted? They seem to be 7,000 different personalities, 7,000 different portraits. Are these actual portraits of actual soldiers? The weapons are real that are buried. They are actual crossbows and spears, battle ready, and they are all buried with this army in the ground with him. I was trying to get a film clip from the movie The Mummy, where they have this amazing sequence where these soldiers come to life. You know what I'm talking about? Remarkable. Go back. So it's a huge, this is a 15-kilometer, wrong button, 15-kilometer long complex with this huge mound in the center. This is where we find the warriors. And so imagine, we're seeing little evidence. So it's so much larger. It's this massive complex. And here's a depiction of what we believe is down there. We haven't dug it up yet. One of the reasons we haven't dug it up yet is because in the historical tale, and who's seen Indiana Jones? Everyone, right? So the historical record claims that crossbows were set up in every passageway so that grave robbers, tomb robbers, would meet their death upon entering any space. And we haven't gone in there yet. It's less because of the fear of crossbows as mercury poisoning, because they stuck a probe down through the mound, and what they find is the levels of mercury under this mound are something like 100 times greater than their natural occurrence. So something's going on here. I'm not going there. I don't know about you. I'll just be, I like these animations just fine. I'm not that curious. Now, one of the reasons we've even heard of this guy, he was a hot potato of Chinese history immediately. The Han Dynasty comes in 206, just 4 years after his death, and says, we're ready to rule. We are the opposite. We will not burn the books and kill all the scholars who wrote them. We understand, and this is where Confucianism gives to the rise, and this is where it connects with the other histories we've seen in China. The importance of Confucianism, the importance of knowing your place, of maintaining, attending to proper relationships in every engagement in society. This is how we move forward as a society and as a people. It's very pragmatic, it's very reasonable, and so the emperors of the Han Dynasty harken back to the sage kings. They leapfrog back in time in history across Shi Huangdi, and they say, we're going back to the sage kings. They knew how to maintain proper relationships for the benefit of humanity, for all of Chinese society. And so from the Han Dynasty, Shi Huangdi is a hot potato. During the early post-Qing Dynasty in 1910, as the early Republican era, they talk about Shi Huangdi and the importance of creating a balance between the rule of law and expression of the people. During the communist China regime, Shi Huangdi is a big deal, right up to the present. And so you see a 2009 rendition of Shi Huangdi, and he's still a hot potato. To what extent is there not enough centralized control? To what extent is there too much centralized control? And you're probably aware of the role of Confucianism throughout this period, but the other big deal is this question of tyranny versus freedom, which continues right through Tiananmen Square and the politics of China today. Questions? Yes?
So are there like agricultural fields around the big mound?
Currently.
So what's happening with all the mercury underground?
A little bit of mercury. I mean, I'm in Shanghai. Talk to me about toxicity. You know, I'm a government official in Beijing. You're going to complain to me about toxicity in the soil? Every day I breathe more mercury than you eat in your lifetime. You know, it is so toxic there right now. It just doesn't register, really. I mean, we could say the same thing about us. We have mercury in our... It used to be in the 90s, the government set a safe level of seafood, freshwater seafood. What is, you know, the question of the US government is how much freshwater seafood is safe to eat? In the 90s, they had to change it dramatically and they calculated it, let's see, 1. one serving of freshwater seafood in your lifetime. And that's to keep the mercury levels down. Now you talk to people, they've readjusted it downward to 0. Just don't eat freshwater seafood, too much mercury. And that's just from batteries and thermometers that your parents used to use, pre-digital thermometers. So, and hopefully the future archaeologists won't say, oh, look at them. They didn't realize the dangers of mercury. They perished because of, we see high levels of mercury in their blood. So who knows? That's a great question. There are lots of things like that. Fortunately, the mercury is in the ground. They had to stick a very deep probe to get to those levels. But we have uranium and other things to worry about.
Why would you need to probe it if there's mercury? Can you just, it's like, that's visible through the soil.
Well, the soil doesn't have the mercury. It's in the chamber that they believe there's mercury left over from 2,000 years ago. From this, I mean, that's a lot of mercury.
Well, I know, so there's gotta be things that can bounce off of it like a radar.
Go for it. Go study that. You'd think, right? Mercury is heavy metal. You'd think you'd be able to sense that remotely through lots of soil. I don't know. I think the ground soundings that I'm aware of are not electromagnetic to that depth. I think there's only sonic, but I could be wrong. You guys are the experts on this. Other questions? What about big things? The story of history, how we tell history. The history that we get is to reinforce Confucian wisdom against this evil Xi'an group. And we see that throughout Gilgamesh, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The story of history is told with an eye towards the present and the future. And we're doing that no differently than they are. We are susceptible to that, no different than Homer was. It's just that by going backwards, hopefully we have a sense, we become sensitized to those multiple lenses, right up to Alois Riegel's, what's important to us now, and given what's important to us now, how then must we tell the story of history? Or how then do we subconsciously distort the telling of history? And so that's the big theme that I'd like to leave you with, because it reinforces this idea of going back in time and how it allows us to not just look at these events as if they really happened. I'm sure something happened, but our understanding of what happened is like in the Parthenon. The actual evidence is a screen upon which we project so many other things. And are we looking at the screen at what actually happened, and or are we looking at the projections that are bouncing off that screen? And we're seeing what we want to see. So any questions about that?